Hello everyone, this is Dan Miller from Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, and today we're continuing our study of how to create our own solo once we've learned the melody. Okay, we've learned a melody. Hopefully we've tried to learn that by ear. Hopefully we've started out with a simple song, and we've been working with this song, When the Saints Go Marching In. The reason is because it's a fairly simple song in relation to its melody and its chord progression. So we're going to start with a simple song, and then we're going to sort of, the idea here is you start with that melody, you learn that melody, so you can play it in your sleep, right? You learn the most critical notes to that melody, what we call the anchor notes, and we figured those out for When the Saints Go Marching In several videos ago. And in the last video, we took that melody and we added some strum and, well, you might say in the guitar world is a Carter style, where we're playing a melody note and we're filling in the gaps between the melody notes with a strum kind of action on the chord, okay? This is the whole key to figuring out and finding your own solos. Once you find the melody, is how to fill in those gaps between the melody. And this is folks that are trying to figure out melody, not melody, but trying to figure out solos once they have the melody to a vocal tune, because vocal tunes tend to be pretty melodically sparse, much more so than fiddle tunes, is that they don't know what to do with that space. They don't know how to fill in that space. And this is what we're talking about here. And the first approach I like to take is what I call the technique approach. Is you just take basic techniques that you may have learned, and this can include chordal strums, hammer-ons, pull-off slides, double stops, tremolo, cross-picking, what we might call neighboring notes, and we'll talk about these kind of things, and what we might term as folded scales or scale patterns. And you learn how to fill in the space between those anchor notes. In bluegrass especially, the audience likes to hear melody, not so much in maybe rock and roll and blues and jazz and other genres, but in bluegrass, the audience likes to hear melody. So what we're going to do is take a pared down sparse melody. Again, we call these anchor notes, the notes that define the song. It's good to learn the melody as it's sung, but some of those notes you can even leave out. We want to get down to the bare bones of that song so that we can play the minimal amount of notes and still make it recognizable as that song. And then we build back up from there by adding our techniques between the notes, okay? This is what I call the technique approach. Later we'll talk about what I call the theoretical approach, and later again we'll talk about what I might term the intuitive approach, okay? But we're going to start with the technique approach because I think that's kind of the easiest way to go. And what I have my students do is not try to swallow too much all at once. So I might say, okay, we've learned the melody and you've gotten so you know that melody really well. Now let's try to fill in with, and then whatever technique it is, and don't go away from that technique, just use that technique the whole time. And that will give you familiarity with that technique, and also it will give you ideas about where that technique might work best when you're starting to combine these techniques later, okay? So that's the way I approach it, that's the way I have my students approach it. And so last time we did this idea where we were playing the melody note as sort of a downstroking. On the guitar you look at it as like a bass strum sort of technique, but we're doing melody strum, and we did that last time. So this time I want to move on to a couple other things. First I'm going to start with the tremolo, and then maybe add the double stops, the neighboring note idea, and then this thing I call a toggle, which we'll talk about later. And if we have time, maybe we'll start to introduce some cross-picking too. But here we go. So the idea of the tremolo, and I'm going to, for the purposes of this, I'm going to loosely define tremolo. Most people think of a tremolo as just repeated at eighth notes on one note or one string. This kind of thing. And with the mandolin players are very familiar with that. That's a common technique in the mandolin world. And so if we just wanted to use that technique to fill in the gap between melody notes in the Saints Go Marching In, we might go. Okay, now that's kind of monotonous. You're not going to want to just stay with that. But again, take that technique and work it like that so that you can get accustomed to it, you can get used to it, you can see where it fits well and where it doesn't fit well. Now that was kind of just playing a lot of up and down, up, down, eighth notes on those melody notes to continue one note until it's time for the next note, okay? I'm going to define tremolo here for our purposes as repeating the melody note until the next melody note comes along, and that's not always going to be necessarily in this eighth note type of thing, because that gets monotonous and boring. Okay, you can use any kind of rhythmic content that you want to do. I could do, which is sort of like the da-da-da-da-da, the potatoes people call them, or whatever name you have for that. Da-da-da-da-da-da. You can do that. You don't have to go da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You could go. Combine them. Whatever combination of that single note played, you can change it rhythmically however you want to do it. Okay? You could also play not necessarily the same exact note, but the same note on a different string. I could go. To me, that's the same thing. I'm playing the same note. I'm playing an A note here and an A note here, but I'm toggling back and forth between the two. Makes it sound a little bit more interesting sometimes. Change the rhythm to that. Change it to syncopated rhythm. Change it to whatever rhythm feels good to you. So again, you can repeat that same note, and it doesn't have to be all eighth notes. You can just be very creative with the rhythmic presentation of that single note. The next thing you could do is what we might term is an articulation. Especially, it's kind of hard to do on an open string, but if you're on that closed string, because again, that's the A note there, the same note, I could go. So articulation to me means that I can do a couple things. I can let that note ring out, I can cut it off like that, or I can just have it muted like that. It's another way to articulate. So I could use that technique and go. Again, not something you want to use all the time, but it is a technique in your toolbox that you could bring out to again make things seem a little bit more interesting when you're just repeating that one note. Now the next thing you could do is dynamics. You know, there's another thing. You know, instead of going, have everything at the same level, you can have some of those notes pop out, some of those notes be held back, and so there's lots of things you can do besides just go, which we might base under the umbrella of a tremolo, which again loosely defined here just means a repeated note. So you've got a lot of tools that you could use when you're using any technique: articulation, dynamics, tonality of that note versus that note, same note but on a different string. This is a wound string, this is a unwound string, so you got a little bit different timbre to those notes. So there's lots of places you could go and lots of things you can work with. Now along those lines, I just want to point out a few things that I've learned along the way. I've been fortunate in that, having been involved with music publications for the last 25 years, 20 years with Flat Picking Guitar magazine, and then now spending time interviewing people for Bluegrass Unlimited magazine and the podcast that we put out. You know, I've got the opportunity to interview a lot of very talented players, a lot of very talented teachers, and so just pass along a couple words of wisdom from several people that I've interviewed. Number one, it's not too long ago I interviewed Matt Flinner, and those of you that mandolin players know Matt is a phenomenal mandolin player. And I asked him what common problem he saw in students that he's been teaching over the years, and the thing he said, which was, I think, brilliant, was that, you know, I expected him to talk about some technical details, but what he said was patience, you know, and I think that's true. I mentioned this in one of the guitar videos, that all of the guys that I know that are really, really just phenomenal players, they spend a lot of time working one little thing that you or I might think is kind of insignificant, or maybe spend a little bit of time with, but guys that I know that are really, really good guys, and girls that I know that are really, really talented and really, really good at what they do, they spend a lot of time on little things and doing them over and over and over again. And so part of that is the exploration of a technique as simple as maybe a tremolo. You might think this is a very simple technique, but there's a lot to it. There's a lot to study about it. There's a lot to study about how to angle the pick so you can play your tremolo faster, you know, how to articulate the notes, how to use dynamics, how to use rhythmic, you know, these things we've been talking about. There's a lot in the study of a simple thing like a tremolo that most people might say, oh yeah, tremolo, I got it, you know, but they're not going to delve deep and dig way down and see all the possibilities of something like a tremolo. And that's, I think, what separates the great players from the players that aren't as great, is that they have the patience to really dig in and spend a lot of time with one thing that may seem to be, you know, like a simple thing. I know one day I was interviewing a guy named Luke Bulla, fantastic guitar player, fiddle player, and his roommate was Chris Thiele, and Chris was in his room just doing something real simple over and over and over again, and he came out of his room in the kitchen where Luke and I were sitting, and I said, Chris, what are you doing in there? And he said, oh man, I'm just trying to make sure that I can get my upstrokes and my downstrokes to sound the same, right? And so, I mean, he was in there for a long time, just playing over and over and over again, these simple little phrases. And that was he was working on, is something just what may seem simple, but here he is working it over and over and over again. He had the patience to do that, and then, you know, that's why he's as good as he is. Anyway, that's just a little tip that I've learned along the way, is be patient with each thing you're learning and really try to dive deep. Try to, instead of learning the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, spend more time with each thing that you're learning. The other idea was that Jack Pearson, fantastic, one of the best guitar players in the world probably. I interviewed Jack years ago, and he said that he likes to do what he calls exercises, where he calls them limiting exercises. And what that means is he'll limit himself to one thing and try to be as creative with that one thing as he can possibly be. Like he might just take a minor pentatonic scale and say, I have to play a solo just using that scale in just this area of the fingerboard for 10 minutes, you know. And once his common ideas are used up, he's got to keep going and keep going and keep coming up with new things. And that's something that you could do, we could call a limiting exercise, something where you learn to play something like When the Saints Go Marching In, only using tremolo, and use all of the different aspects of the tremolo to try to make that solo interesting. Like the solo I just played with a straight eighth note, you know, sort of without dynamics, just using a straight eighth note, it works, but it's not as interesting as it could be had I used dynamics, had I used articulation, had I used rhythmic phrasing. All of those things can make stuff more interesting, and you're not going to be able to discover all that stuff unless you do what Jack calls his limiting exercise. But I'm going to play this song 5 times through, and the only thing I'm going to do is use to fill in between the melody notes as a tremolo. Let me see how many different ways I can come up with doing that. That's a really great exercise with whatever you're limiting yourself to. And the third thing I was going to throw out there was something when I was interviewing David Greer. David said, there aren't any boring songs, only boring arrangements. Meaning, you can take any song which people might think is really simple or uninteresting, and it's up to you and your creative process to make it interesting and to make it something that is fun for you and captivating to the audience. That's all you in what you choose to do with it. So that's another thing to think about. I thought I'd throw out there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to think about is double stops, right? So we did this tremolo on one string, and then double stop is just playing two consecutive strings together out of the chord. So if we're on the D chord, we can play this, right? We talked about last time, that doesn't sound bad to leave that E note open, even though it's not in the chord. Doesn't sound bad, sort of acts as like a little drone if you use it that way, and it doesn't have a harsh tonality when combined with that A note. So again, you'd go through the whole thing just like the tremolo really, but just adding another note from the chord. So it might sound something like this. Exactly the same as the tremolo, but adding another note from the chord into the tremolo motion makes it sound a little bit fuller. And once again, by itself, it's not that interesting, but you can combine it with tremolo, you can do the different rhythmic things, you could do the different articulations, you could go to different chord shape positions. You could just see how many different chord shape positions for that chord that you could come up with. For each chord, you could do the A here. I did the A here. You could do the A here. We talked about last time. I did the D here, but you could also come down here and do a D there. There's a lot of different ways you can work that out. You could do a G here. You could do a G here. There's all kinds of different double stop positions you could explore. That would be one way to create variations just using that one technique like we talked about. Dig down deep into double stops, and you can come up with a lot of different creative ways to play that solo using double stops. Then go back and combine the double stops and the tremolo and see what you can come up with that way. Okay? The next thing that you can do, okay, so we got the tremolo and we got the double stops. There's a couple techniques that can be come off of that. The tremolo, this idea of neighboring notes is another way to make a tremolo idea more interesting. The most simple way to do it, neighboring note, just mean adding a note in that's real close to the note you're making the tremolo on in the scale, or just in proximity. It doesn't have to be in the scale. It'll sound a little bit more dissonant if it's not in the scale, but you can get a bluesy tone or something like that out of that. So just as an example, instead of that, I'm going to go something like that. I can work almost an endless number of ways to throw other notes in there instead of just going, right? I play this note, can play this note, I can play this note, this note. You can throw other notes that are around that note in there, and you can get some variety and some variation. You don't even have to know, you know, here I'm playing notes out of the scale, but you don't have to play notes out of the scale, and you don't have to play, know what the scale is. Just play notes that are close to that note that you're repeating, and see what sounds good or not. You may go, that may sound good, or try, it's outside the scale, has a little bit of dissonance to it, but hey, you might be able to use it. Sounds a little weird maybe. Go with any note that's around the note that you're playing the tremolo on. Some will work for you, some won't work for you, some you may like, some others may not like. Just play around with it. This is that, you know, spending time experimenting kind of thing. So that's another way you can do this. Take it 2 measures at a time. This first 2 measures, you know, just see where you can go with it. Anything. Just try it out, see what works for you, see what doesn't work for you, okay? And again, you don't have to study a scale in order to do that. Just play around with notes that are near the note that you might be used as a tremolo, which is the melody note that you just played. Mess around with that space in between there with neighboring notes. Neighboring mean they're close to that melody note. And then mess around with that and get back, and then when you find something that really you sound, maybe that's one that you're happy with. Use that one. Use it twice, or come up with another one you like. Maybe you like that one. That was one note out of the scale. You can come up with lots of variations with this neighboring note idea, okay? Now the next idea is what I call a toggle. And this is basically you're using the notes that you would play as a tremolo, but you're doing them one at a time. So instead of going, I'm going to go, okay? So you could go, you know, again, change the rhythm of it. But that's another thing you can do. So you play a note that's on out of the chord that's on the next string, where like you play a double stop but single notes. See, and you can change the rhythm and variation of that too. So that's another technique that you could use. So today we've gone over a tremolo, double stops, neighboring notes, and toggle. And toggle means that I'm on this string and I'm toggling back and forth, or whatever. Toggling back and forth between 2 notes that are in the chord. Okay? So that's 4 techniques that you can mess around with. And again, really spend some time, experiment, dive deep, and then come up with variations. Do the solo just using that technique all the way through, and then come up with ways to combine all those to make it an interesting solo.